And now we are on to our very first panel, which is a discussion on exploring art and science in the wild garden. We are fortunate to have Taylor Johnston as our moderator for all 4 discussion panels during the symposium. Taylor is an American gardener, designer, and nurserywoman. With an insatiable curiosity, you may find Taylor trialing oriental cultivars of hydrangea, botanizing in Greek meadows, or creating tropical plant displays for the Guggenheim, while also working on hardy perennial borders for private clients. Please join me in welcoming Taylor, along with the first 3 panelists whom you have already met, Keith Wiley, Olivier Filippi, and Cassian Schmidt. Okay, hello, testing. Is this good? In here? All right, great. So to start, I'm wondering, after hearing James's talk, if a single term like ecological gardening is perhaps helpful to describe the breadth and spectrum of the work that we've been hearing about today. Clearly, we all have trade-offs to make based on where we're located geographically and the particular value sets that we hold near and dear. What are your thoughts? Cassian, you go.
It's always, as I said, it's always difficult to put a wide range under a certain term. And from a scientific point, what is ecological? It's the relationship between organisms, including human beings. So is the gardener part of the ecology of a design, or is it not? Maybe it is in a certain place. And there is no real nature anymore in Middle Europe, in no countries. It's all semi-natural, actually, and the garden is also semi-natural, and it always depends on what kind of ecology you want to achieve. Hansen had this in mind to combine aesthetics, ecology, and maintenance, and I think it has to do a lot with maintenance. I think the how you deal with plants, with the shifting of plants. You have to accept the dynamic, the shifting, the self-seeding, so the resilience of a planting. I think this is important, so that a planting is not seen as a static picture. So it has to move on. That makes it very difficult, and so a gardener has to learn to link in with natural processes, to support processes, but it has also be guidelined by a certain goal, and that's what James said. We have the problem with these very ecological plantings. What is the goal? Where it should be end up after 10, 50 years? And it's in a block planting, it's very easy to say it has to be like it is. But in an ecological planting, it's very difficult. And this term is always put on a planting that looks natural. You know, this naturalistic is not nature. It's a picture of nature, but you know, yeah. Naturalism it doesn't say anything about ecology, in my opinion, because ecology means all these relationships. But also monoculture is ecological, because there are relationships between soil and plants and organisms. So it also diversity, I think, is not certainly a point of good ecology or bad ecology, as we heard. So it's very difficult to define what is really ecological. And in Germany, ecological is also always synonymous with organic sometimes, or native and non-native, and all these discussions. So there is a wide range of terms you mix up, and I think nowadays ecology is very diffuse.
Right.
In its proper term, it was clear relationship between organisms, but now it's very diffuse, and it's more a certain ideologically, right. A little bit. So, and it's a wide range to discuss, I think.
So we could just say all of that when anyone asks? Building on definitions, it strikes me that one of the tenets of, quote, ecological gardening that we've been hearing about is the belief that a garden ought to be functional. Surprisingly, I haven't heard anyone mention the term pollinators yet,
And so I wonder, for all of you, how are you defining function, if it's important to your work, and if we really ought to be considering it as seriously as aesthetic concerns?
Okay. I cut off from my talk all the insect part because I didn't have time. But usually there's a whole section on insects, because for us, flowers in the Mediterranean, we have few, not enough to make it a goal for aesthetic design, but then flowers are a key, have a key importance for us, for insects, and for the general, how do you say, chain of the birds and everything. So we study a lot plant-insect interaction. It's one of our key focus. We do more entomology than botany at the stage where we are, and it is very important in the Mediterranean, yeah. But about ecological gardening, I would join what you say. We don't use the term. For us, it's an ethical approach, and which is cultural. We use the term of a garden adapted to the goal. What's the goal of the client and of the garden designer? And if it works, then it has to be an ecological garden, because everything is ecological, including monoculture or a lawn. It's a perfect system if it works. If it fails, it's not. And surprisingly enough, often what is called ecological gardening is just a gardening that fails.
Interesting.
Well, I wonder what you mean by actually functional. Functional,
Perfectly,
functional in terms of people use?
It's actually a perfectly acceptable answer to give another question. I myself am confused. And when
I mean, if I was talking about a functional garden, I mean, I would say somebody, does it grow vegetables? You know, I mean, if we're talking functional, I don't sort of assume functional within the same terms as aesthetics. Really functional. If somebody's got a functional garden, they've got a vegetable garden that they're growing vegetables in. I mean, it's functional in terms of the insects. I mean, if we're talking about functional in terms of the ecosystem, then I can see there's value. I would have something to add on that, but I don't grow vegetables.
Okay, so
I really functionality in my is not there.
If I might clarify really quickly, when you say pertaining to insects, do you mean per square meter, how many you encounter, or how many are visiting the garden at a particular time of year, particular time of day? How do you calibrate that observation?
Well, here comes the word functional.
Yeah.
We try to understand who is coming in a flower and why. And the functional row in the ecosystem chain. So there's a functional row of the insects. So that's interesting. And why are we interested by insects? Because we're interested by pesticide-free gardening. And we cannot garden in the Mediterranean with water and do pesticide-free, because water creates fungus and a complete range of problems. And so the first entry is to do a dry garden, and then the second entry is to have the wildlife, which creates the balance of the ecosystem. So insects are really part of it.
Wildlife including grazers, or?
Including everything.
Yeah.
Including everything.
I mean, insects are absolutely vital for us. I mean, the garden that we have may well be aesthetic, but it has a massive, I don't know numbers, but it's absolutely alive with insects, and insects are extremely important. They're the bottom of the food chain, whether it be the ones that are eating my plants or not. If you have a very intense, densely planted garden, if it's being attacked by insects, so what? You know.
In another way, I think functional could mean that it's a space that cleans or cools. So in urban spaces, like Cassian showed, potentially this is a part of your thought process as well. Yeah.
These are these functions that plantings can have in the city, like stormwater management and all this, or roof gardens. They have also a function of delay the runoff and all these things. And maybe this has nothing to do with the aesthetic of the planting, like James showed, to bring it together, the function in a city and the aesthetics, but also functional aesthetical. the aesthetic function, I think it's very important for the people, because if you're thinking about insects, this is important, but I think if you deal in an urban space, I think the human beings are important. We do it first, in my opinion, for human beings, that they have a nice environment, and they have a feeling, a little bit of a feeling of nature. It's a man-made nature, and then maybe second, the insect, because on a traffic island you can't evoke a whole ecosystem. You know, of course you can attract pollinators, and I think these stressful environments are usually the more useful for insect, because they are quite rare in our flora. Because we have these dry areas, they are rare because we are a woodland country, so this attracts a lot of this open space, warm, sunny spaces. There are a lot of specialized insects, not the ubiquitous. And this can also help these little pockets or stepping stones between landscapes. So it can have an effect, I think, and this could be also a function as an ecological stepping stone between natural areas also.
Right,
But
interesting.
even in my case, design follows functionality, in that the water, I mean, the whole place is designed to functionally drain all the water down and reuse all the water. So design is following functionality there. The whole design of the garden was designed to create water down through there.
Yeah, that's an
So-
important point.
Probably all those words are imprecise, and it's good that they stay imprecise, because a garden is a multi-purpose goal, and so function is just the way to reach a goal, and there are many, many different goals in the same garden.
That's a great point. So I'd love to know from all of you what the oldest garden that you would consider to be ecologically minded, what the age of the garden would be, and if you would say maintenance increases or decreases with age, or how you might interpret that. We can start with Keith.
Well, I mean, they do change quite definitely, the gardens. They change quite significantly, because I tend to start with a lot of species in there, and it thins out. And you just go with the flow on it changing. You have to go with the flow. I mean, as was mentioned several times this morning, you adapt and modify it. So the gardens that you've actually got don't actually bear that much resemblance to the ones that you started out. Whether they are ecological or not, I know not. But they still support a lot of wildlife, and they get less maintenance. For me, if you're modifying them, it was, as was said this morning, if you try and hold them, the more you try and hold them still, the more maintenance I think there is involved in it. I would also say the smaller the amount of height that you're getting in a garden, the more maintenance it is. If I tried to have a garden full of rhodohypoxis and alpines, it is extremely labour intensive. I don't know whether you've used any of those, Cassian. But those type of gardens, I mean, if you get a willow herb growing in a small amount of grass, you've got to weed it out. I found before at the garden house that if I kept all my edges of the garden immaculately tidy, all the hedges razor sharp, and I weeded perfectly the first 8 inches of all the borders, everybody would say how amazingly tidy it was. Totally ignoring the fact that there could be a milk thistle 5 foot high back in the bed there. The point was they didn't know whether that milk thistle was meant to be there or not, so they weren't sure whether it was a weed. So but the smaller the sort of matrix of plants that you've got, the more labour intensive it becomes. But those also can be, once they cover over, can actually, and therefore exclude light, can be quite relatively maintenance free. But that's, I can't say, I would have said most of I haven't really gone beyond about 8 or 9 years, really.
Interesting.
I can't go beyond that.
Great.
I love to study old gardens to understand the dynamic of evolution, and we have in Montpellier, near where I live, the oldest botanical garden in France, and there's something which is called La Montagne de Richer, which was a habitat garden created for students in botany and in medicine at the end of the 17th century. And the interesting thing is that for lack of money and civil wars and all that, this part of the garden has been abandoned during about 2 centuries. So it's interesting to see an ecological garden because nothing has been done after 2 or 3 centuries. And of course, like in a Mediterranean ecosystem, it has turned to be a forest with including exotic species. And the gardeners have recently decided to keep the north-facing side of the montagne. It mimics a mountain of the Montagne de Richer without touching it. So you see the forest which has come by itself, and the south-facing has been totally cleared. And they, like after the normal disturbance cycle in the Mediterranean linked to fire or wood cutting, and they have replaced the forest which had come by a collection of allelopathic plants, a collection of cistus species, and a collection of phlomis species. So it's interesting to see the building up of the biomass and then cutting down, which is typical of Mediterranean cycle, and then the replacement of one part of that old garden by a contemporary approach of stopping the evolution.
Interesting. How about you?
Well, my experience is about 20 years from plantings when I started in Hermannshof, and we really keep record for 20 years now about the maintenance. And I wouldn't always agree that a planting would go always, in the rural stage, in the pioneer stage, is always higher maintenance. You can reduce this with mulching. That comes from these first levels right down to a more later successional stage, so you can shorten it down. But then I think it's not true that then you keep the level of like 5 minutes per square meter a year. So what we found out, there is a 5 years period, and then you have a peak again. You have to do something because plants are shifting, you have to control it a little bit. Maybe you have dominant plants you don't want from a design point. You can leave it, but then you end up with less species. So if you want to have a little bit more control, you have to control it. And this peaks it because you have implemented disturbance, and that's, you have patchiness, and then it starts again. So you have some weed invasion. So we found that it's after 5 years there's a little bit peak, and then it levels again, but it doesn't go down to zero, right. Of course, in a nature conservancy, of course, but in a horticultural planting, the minimum is about 1 minute per square meter in woodland plantings, and these are the most equal. But on sunny sides, it's a little bit more ebb and flow. But anyways, we keep rapid for 20 years, and my opinion is on fertile soil, density is very important. I think these are the most stable plantings I've seen, with few species, maybe 5 or 6, but they cover the ground, and there you have to do almost nothing, just cutting down, and that's it, shredding it through the soil. The more open sites, they are the more difficult. If if you don't plant, or if you don't evaluate the site right, if it's too moist or too fertile, and if you plant a dry planting, an open planting, then you can have really high maintenance. So if the site is right, stressful enough, then it works. But I think the dense plant communities are easier. They're not as visual as nice, but I think they're a little bit easier to keep over the years. So I think they're the most persistent on mesic soil with tall forb communities, because they belong in our surroundings.
Right.
These dry parts are really on special sites, usually along rivers, on south-facing side. If you have the conditions, then it works perfectly. But usually, if you don't have the conditions, it can be troubleful. But on traffic islands, on engineered soil, it's only like 10% volume percent of organic matter. The rest is just gravel and grit and sand, different sizes. That works very well. So really to go low nutrient, this is important. And then you have all these connections of plant, allelopathy and all these things probably going on, and then you can keep it very, very stable. But it's depending on soil preparation, matching the plants to the site, and also the maintenance stuff. This is the most important, I think, to keep it alive over the years. And we have good stuff for 20 years, and in a garden you can do it. On a traffic island we have now, I think, 15 years of experiences. And if there is a crew, and some cities have almost the same crew, it works. In other cities it totally fails. After 5 years it can be ruined, the whole planting. If there's Solidago in it or so and nobody sees it. So it depends really on the maintenance, I think. It's the most important. I think 80% is good maintenance stuff.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you think that we are training gardeners to really engage with the type of processes that we've seen today? Do you feel that we're well prepared to put these ideas into greater practice?
Not yet.
Not yet.
What can we do?
Well, we have to be, I hope all of you are gardeners in public spaces, and we have to move on the word, and you have to write books and speak about that, about the key success through maintenance and the intelligence and pleasure of maintenance. It's a new way of seeing the bad side of gardening. It suddenly explodes and becomes the best side of gardening. And so this is like incentive for new gardeners in towns and in private gardens, because if suddenly they have the freedom to do their garden, what they want, and not the obligation to follow the rules which have been decided by a garden designer somewhere in Germany and who lives now elsewhere, it totally changes. The maintenance gardener can be the artist and the long-term designer. So, yeah, we have to spread the word.
I think there's a musical sort of analogy a little bit here. I think that we can all learn the basic chords, but to do this style of gardening, but to really sort of explore the personal side of it, to, if you like, to jam with jazz, I think you need to know those basic chords to start with. And I would say what I do is, and like many of us, you learn the basic chords, and then you go off and you increasingly start to jam with the jazz. And I think that's something that happens, I think, and it's fairly easy to teach people what the basic chords of combinations of plants and things can be. The maintenance, I would count on some of it is another sort of chord, another set of chords that we need to learn. There are a lot of the style, once you become more aesthetic on the line of it, a lot of it is still to do with the eye, the creative eye of what there is in there. But
Debatable if you can teach that to a person, right?
What the creative eye part of it, I think the creative eye is just an instinctive thing there, really. I mean, my wife paints, and a lot of it, you can paint by numbers, or you can paint from what comes up from within you. And I would suggest that it's difficult. For me, it comes from within, and I'm not sure where it's from.
Yeah.
It just appears to happen. It's when I try to analyze where it's coming from that I get into difficulties, really. It's just instinctive. That's what I mean by the eye.
Yeah, actually, I think this is an important point, because I wonder how this style of gardening has a place in especially historic gardens, where there's less freedom to be intuitive and creative. Do you see a place for these ideas in historic properties?
Maybe I can go back to this point before. I think there are two things to consider. At least in Germany, a gardener has a reputation of, he's the weeder. He does things that he did forever. There's a tradition of gardening. And the problem is that we have also the responsibility. All here are keen gardeners, and we have to train or take the next generation and train the next generation. And I think that trainees go in different gardens and see different styles of maintenance is also very important. Then they can choose, is it the Dixter style or is it the Hermannshof maintenance? There are different styles or different approaches. And so I think this is important, and to be open to new techniques and strategies for maintenance. Gardeners are a little bit backward thinking, we have done it for years and this is good. And this is sometimes always the problems from the gardeners, but also to hand over the new ideas that a planting or ecological planting has different traits, and it's very, very intellectual. And it's not just weeding, maintenance is for us, it's creativity, as you said, and it's both, of course, to guideline a planting, and it's much more than the traditional border maintenance, and we have the responsibility. And in Germany, there's evolving a new thinking about that we need really trained people, and there is from the nursery industry, there is now private training programs, especially for these people who maintain public plantings. And
are they funded by?
Well, there is a program. There is also like a diploma, but it's not an official apprenticeship or something. But the nursery industry or the landscapers, they in the southern Germany, they said we have to do something, and they have a course that runs over 2 or 3 years now. Pflanzenverwender, planting. It's not design. It's really plant use, design, maintenance, and so on. And these are really well-trained people. The owners, they pay for the young people to go on this course, and it's a course parallel to their working on weekends and so on. It runs over 2 years. They have it in Switzerland as well, this course, and I think it's a small group, but
sure.
It spreads, and this is maybe an approach to follow.
Right. Do either of you have thoughts on how we might introduce these ideas into historic spaces where there's less creative?
Well, there is a main cultural gap between this man and this man because of the geographical location. A historical garden in the Mediterranean has nothing to do with perennials, because perennials are short-lived, even if they're perennials. And a historical garden is long-lived. So historical gardens in the Mediterranean are linked to structure, architecture of the vegetation, and they have invented 3 centuries ago or 10 what we're trying to do now. Post-fire ecosystem, lignotuber plants. Okay, myrtle. You go to the Alhambra in Spain, and you have myrtles everywhere. Of course, they've understood 10 centuries ago that it's a long-lived plant, very easy to play with for architecture in a historical garden. But of course, we have a different approach because we're not in the same climate.
Right. Do you have anything to say to where we are now with this particular culture, British culture?
I'm...
No? Okay. Keith, you want to grab that hot potato and give it a go?
Well, about historical gardens?
Yeah.
I think that the gardeners have to tread very carefully in new gardens when they're coming in, really. It's a whole set of different skills that you're having to learn. You have to have a very detailed knowledge of the plants, as any of us would know with gardens. If you're going to allow self-seeding to take place, you have to recognize what the plant is at a cotyledon stage. You have to know how it's going to mix in a sort of a community of plants. I find things with big leaves don't work very well in communities of plants. I don't know whether that is something that you have found. I mean, generally, things with smaller, narrower leaves work much better in a community of plants in that you can get more of them in a given space. Things like foxgloves want to take over the world all on their own. So they'd be in a sort of world of one. I think you do, it's a difficult situation. I say the chap who worked with me at the garden house when we started, I mean, to his eternal credit, he learnt a whole set of new skills. But it took some while for him to see that what I was trying to do was sensible to do. But if you've got owners or you've got a sort of trust or something behind you, you've got a whole set of other problems coming in as well. It's difficult, and I think you have to move quite slowly when you're dealing with this and just test the water and see how it is. I mean, after all, when 20 years ago, naturalistic planting was basically very, very unusual. If you looked at, somebody talked about Gardens Illustrated this morning. Gardens Illustrated, there might have been one article in a year on naturalistic planting. Now in the last issue, I mean, half the gardens that were in there were naturalistic planting. So moods have changed, attitudes have changed. And so maybe it's a little bit easier to gradually insinuate it, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Great. How ecologically friendly would you consider the behind-the-scenes work of making your gardens? So lugging, huge loads of gravel or digging out giant trenches. Is there an inherent trade-off or problem or oxymoron in that?
Well, I mean, I come on that one because I had a bare field site. I mean, it's not an ecologically high sort of habitat for wildlife, full stop. So I completely messed it around. I mean, I moved 100,000 tons at least of soil and shill it around to actually make it what it was. But the ecological payoff in terms of wildlife is massive now. So, I mean, I'm biased quite clearly on that one. But it wasn't an ecologically rich site to start with. So I don't feel any problem at all in actually seriously diminishing the slug and snail population, which I did. I didn't have any problems with hostas for the first 2 years afterwards because I think I'd killed all the slugs and snails. So ecologically, I was probably extremely bad in that I killed some insects. But long term, there are vast, vast amounts more. So for me, the payoff was certainly worth messing it around, but I can't speak for anybody else.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts too. Please, Oliver.
Yeah, for us, ecological friendly gardening mainly is pesticide-free gardening. I'm thinking of France. I have no idea in the UK, but France is the third country in the world for consumption of pesticides. Okay, that's a lot. That's before Brazil.
In agriculture?
No, in the whole. And now listen to it. 90% is for agriculture. Okay, the wheat fields and the awful stuff. Okay, and 10% is for the gardens in France. This is incredible, and people have learned to garden with pesticides. So the payoff of an ecological friendly garden, the first thing is to stop the pesticides. And to stop the pesticides in the south of France, we need to have the drainage. So to have the drainage, either you work in a naturally well-drained garrigue, but it's not often the case because of the history of the villages which were in the plains and the new houses which are taken from the agricultural land. And the whole thing, there's no ecology in the agricultural land. It's usually filled with history of pesticide. And if you turn the soil differently and bring gravel, it's not ecologically very friendly, but it's much better than using the pesticides we have used for the last 50 years in France.
Interesting. Do you have any thoughts?
I think it's the same. There are a lot of conflicts, of course. If you do, if you put material which is not on the site, like gravel mulch and so, of course, this is ecologically first-hand. You transport things, it takes off resources, but it's the only way to reduce any pesticides and so on, and any spraying. It's anyways not allowed in Germany to use any herbicides in public spaces for years, and also pesticides anymore. And also for private people, it's getting harder the last 10 years to get any of these pesticides because you can't buy them. You have to have a certain permit to use them. So the harder stuff, really.
Yeah.
You know, the soft things you get, but like glyphosate or so, you can't just get in a shop. So this is a good thing, and we don't use any pesticides or herbicide in our garden. We do it all mechanically, or we do it with the plants itself, actually. So we outcompete these things with the plants on walkways or so. Of course, you have to do, but we do it mechanically. And I think that's easy to do. If you do a diverse planting, match the plants to the environment, I think you don't have to deal with pesticides. Of course, you have some aphids or so, but this is just a phase, and you have birds again that pick them. So I think with perennials, it's not a problem, even in a nursery, to use pesticides. There is no reason for this.
May I ask a question, really?
Please.
I mean, suppose you got bindweed into your garden.
Bindweed is...
Convolvulus. The
Well,
white convolvulus. Suppose
not in the garden.
Suppose you got mare's tail, equisetum, in your garden.
Yeah, this is a problem.
What
Yes.
would you do?
Now, this is the only thing, but we do it mechanically. So,
Yeah.
You would dig it out.
well, we just disturb it. You know, the vegetative parts. It comes again.
Absolutely.
But
yeah.
it doesn't matter in a tall FOB community. It's the ground level. I say, well, it belongs to the environment. It's a weed, and sometimes the people complain, but it never outcompetes these planting.
I mean,
so like Hank Gerritsen did, you know, he did a the ground elder garden.
Right.
You know, just to use competitive plants against your weeds. This is one way to avoid pesticides. So I think we could also integrate these plants, which are not bad plants. Like ground elder is a nice ground cover with nice flowers, and in a more wild garden or in a huge park, why not? And
It's just I know of an organic gardener locally down my way who actually have had to sell their property because they wanted to be organic, and it just got taken over by bindweed and mare's tail and dog's mercury and these other really invasive weeds, and the only option they feel they have is to sell their property now to start again.
Well, this is also a way to...
Extreme.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
important is really to start clean. This is of course very important.
Yeah, but how do you start clean with some of these weeds that actually you leave the minute root in it and it comes
without
again?
chemicals, you mean? Well, you can...
I am saying yes, pesticides no, but herbicides sometimes. There are, sometimes there is no other way, I would have said.
Yeah.
I'm not condoning the use of herbicides, but I'm just saying it's almost impractical for two of us to run 4 acres of garden on our own without a minimal use of an herbicide on something like 2.5 miles of path.
Right. This goes back to the idea of trade-offs again.
It is.
Yeah.
But in public space, it's very important that we have engineered soil. So usually, it's anyways all gravel and new roads, and then I think it's appropriate to use a cover of 25 or 30 centimeters of an engineered mineralic soil, and maybe a fabric underneath that nothing comes through.
Do you think that's
relevant?
relevant?
This is, but in a home garden, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah,
because
that's what I'm saying.
To take soil away and put new soil in, it's not very ecological. There's a conflict. I know.
Yeah. It was in. I understand in public spaces. It was in the private gardens.
And this is very important. The only plantings that work for 10, 15 years are the plantings with engineered weed-free soil. This is a must, actually.
A must, but so inaccessible to most of us. I think we have time for one more question. Okay, so it's kind of a big one. Maybe we can speed through. Keith, you talked a bit about being flexible in your garden.
About being flexible. Yeah.
Yes, and I think you kind of touched on a really important point about the difference between what a plant tolerates and what it requires. You've done a lot of experimenting, and I think that difference is actually something we don't really talk a lot about. How do you sift through the difference, and what makes you suspect something might work where you might think, it's kind of taking a risk?
I'm not sure that. I think your work out pretty much. I don't have very many occasions when I put plants in where I don't think that they work. Really, I don't put them in until I've probably had a lot of thought about them before they go in. Obviously, some don't work.
Sure.
And I'm not sure I've got very much to add on that one at the moment.
Okay.
Unless I hear where we're going somewhere else, you know.
Well, I mean, do you have any thoughts on this idea that we should describe plants as being okay in moist, you know, well-draining, loamy soils? Do you think we should be more specific, or perhaps?
Oh, quite definitely, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, as is obvious, really, from what we've been talking about before. By creating all the different habitats that I have, by these incredibly different well-drained soils and heights and everything else, you're getting a whole range of habitats. I'm also able, by bringing the soil back in varying amounts, something I didn't mention this morning. Some places I only put 2 inches of soil, some other places I put no soil, other places I've got 6 foot, 2 meters of soil. You're matching the plants to suit those conditions. That's just something that I'm doing automatically. So in a way, you're already deciding where plants grow. It is. I would say one interesting thing about what's happening this year. You talked about Rogersias actually earlier this morning. Rogersias in the garden, where I put them in made-up beds with soil. This summer in the heat, at the end of July, they did start actually going over really quite badly. On a shillet bank, which is just stone, nothing else but stone, they had seeded down onto that bank. They showed no signs whatsoever of the hot weather on them this year. Their roots must have gone right down deep into the shillet and the stone and found moisture somewhere deep. And they didn't show any signs whatsoever. So in made-up soil, plants that actually are supposed to like moisture were actually going over and yet growing in incredibly well-drained soil, which looks impossible to grow something like woodland conditions. They were absolutely no signs whatsoever of stress.
Thrilling.
Absolutely amazing.
Great. Did you have something to add, Oliver?
No, it was kind of a bad joke.
Please tell.
It's a good way.
I'll try my way. I'll try to say it in a nice way. You create habitats, and then you have a problem with Equisetum and Convolvulus, which are typically habitat-linked plants. So create a habitat for them and another habitat where they can't grow, and you don't have the pesticide.
I don't have a problem
Yeah, I understand
personally
it's the
with
yeah.
bindweed and Equisetum.
clear.
I'm just talking about other people
Yeah.
who did
Yeah.
and throwing out the point.
But
about
it's interesting because we're interested in what we call, I don't call it like that, but ecological gardening. It's a perception of nature by man. And we have frontiers. This is what I call ecological gardening, but this is not. And some plants I like because it's native, but this plant I don't like because it's not native, or because it's native and I have learned to hate it, or because I just hate it. And maybe instead of changing everything, you can change the look of the gardener on the thing. Equisetum is very beautiful.
Yeah, that I said with ground elder.
Yeah.
Change your attitude to plants.
Sure.
No, what I would like to add about plants, you know, the range of plants, where they thrive or not thrive. What you see in nature is not obviously what the plant likes.
Yes.
It's what the plant is adapted to.
Yeah.
Right.
In correlation to competition, you know, so a lot of not competitive plants are pushed to the side, either to the moist or to the dry side, but they don't like dry sides or they don't like moist side. They're adapted to it, and this makes the difference. So in a garden habitat, they can thrive in a wider range with a little support of the gardener. This makes it a difference. You know, this is why a magnolia, as James showed, grows in a very wet spot in the nature, but it grows on normal garden soil
Yes, I remember Jim Archibald, who used to collect a lot of seeds, asking him where a particular erythronium, what it liked in the wild. And he said it's not necessarily what it's like, it's what it's been left with.
Right.
Yeah,
And I think
right.
that's just
big
backing
point.
up your point
And
there,
I
really.
think it's for me, I found out it's more important. Well, soil, everything is good, and pH, I think it doesn't matter so much if you don't take rhododendrons. I think the most important, that what thrives the longevity of a plant community is really competition. That you have the levels of competition right, and this is the most difficult actually. And this is not in the books really.
Right.
So the interaction between plants and where they use their niches, and to predict this, how they will behave in 10, 15 years, this makes it so difficult. And just an example, Platycodon grandiflorum,
Sure.
which is a plant that comes very late in spring. So in a normal border, you have it a few years and then it's gone. And I put it in my prayer plantings, and it's the same level of late emerging plants, and it grows like crazy, and it's even invasive now. So plants that you thought are really, difficult,
Sure.
in another combination of plants can be really invasive. That makes it also so dangerous for, neophytes that you can't predict. It really depends on the
Context.
community, what you put next to it, and
Right.
this makes it so different. There are no rules actually, or well, the Hansen lists are good, but they don't take in mind the competition levels and so on.
In a way, this uncertainty also makes it quite exciting.
Yeah,
I think that's a really
and
good
sometimes
point.
you have to use things that are not in the books, and if you don't, sometimes it's good to make mistakes. You think it's a mistake, like planting a rhodgasia in a gravel bank, but then you see it thrives. So, and sometimes in nature, we saw Eremerus robustus next to Angelicas, in a
Right.
tall forb meadow. It's not a steppe plant as you think. And so it opened your eyes to see it in nature, but you usually can't imitate it right away in a garden situation.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, because I think we might actually be out of time. Yeah, she's nodding. You know how strict she is.
But
so-
it'll be very short.
Okay, all right.
I love the way you say prairie plantation, because I hear prayer plantation, like the new religion.
Fantastic. Thank you all.